This is the history of protest songs in the United States. Part 5. The 20th Century. In the 20th century, the Union Movement, the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and the war in Vietnam all inspired protest songs. 1940s to 1950s, the labor movement versus McCarthyism. The 1940s and 1950s saw the rise of music that continued to protest labor, race, and class issues. Protest songs continued to increase their profile over this period, and a rising number of artists appeared who were to have an enduring influence on the protest music genre. However, the movement and its protest singers faced increasing opposition from McCarthyism. One of the most notable pro-union protest singers of the period was Woody Guthrie. "This land is your land," Deportee. 1913 Massacre, Dust Bowl Blues. Tom Joad, whose guitar bore a sticker which read, "This machine kills fascists." Guthrie was also an occasional member of the hugely influential labor movement band the Almanac Singers, founded by Millard Lample, Lee Hayes, and Pete Seeger, which had a floating personnel. Politics and music were closely intertwined with the Almanac's Popular Front political beliefs. Their first release in May 1941, an album called Songs for John Doe, performed by Seeger, Hayes, Lample, Josh White, and Sam Gary, urged non-intervention in World War II and opposed the peacetime draft and unequal treatment of African American draftees. A month after it was issued, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt issued an order banning racial and religious discrimination in defense hiring. The Almanacs immediately switched to a pro-war position, and the Songs for John Doe album was withdrawn and all copies destroyed. Their second album, Talking Union, was a collection of 6 labor songs, union-made. "I don't want your millions, mister. Get thee behind me, Satan." "Union Train. Which side are you on?" And of course, the eponymous, Talking Union, sung by Guthrie, who had joined the group in July. This album, issued in July 1941, was not anti-Roosevelt. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of that year, the Almanacs issued a strongly pro-war, pro-Roosevelt album, Dear Mr. President, that included Guthrie's Reuben James, 1942, and several of them enlisted in the Army, Seeger, or Merchant Marine, Guthrie and Cisco Houston. The Almanacs were widely criticized in the press for switching positions, especially by Dr. Karl Joachim Friedrich, a Harvard political scientist who was in charge of military propaganda for domestic consumption and wrote prolifically for popular magazines. In 1948, Hayes and Seeger organized a quartet, which also included a young Ronnie Gilbert and Fred Hellerman, to accompany international folk dancing to raise money for their organization People's Songs. Initially known as the No Name Quartet, by 1950 it was enjoying great popular success as the Weavers. Several of the Weavers' most popular songs, such as If I Had a Hammer, were protest songs or implicitly supported Israel, Sina, 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 although the political content was not explicit. Although some in the left-wing press derided them as having sold out their beliefs in exchange for popular success, their fans nevertheless recognized what their songs were about because their international and multiracial repertoire strongly suggested support for racial justice and world peace. Because of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, the Weavers' managers directed them to avoid appearing at progressive venues and prohibited them from performing or recording songs with political content. Former Almanac members Seeger and Hayes were listed in the publication Red Channels, and a former communist who had worked at People's Songs, Harvey Matusow, denounced the group as Communist Party members. He later recanted and admitted that he had lied. Although their manager went to the Red Channel's office in person and with promises that the group would avoid trouble, they were placed under FBI surveillance and blacklisted by the entertainment industry during the McCarthyism era. Right-wing and anti-communist groups protested at their performances and harassed promoters. As a result, a planned Weavers' television appearance was cancelled, they lost radio airplay and royalties, and Decca Records terminated their recording contract. Because of its New Deal and Popular Front associations, folk music itself was under a cloud as potentially subversive, regardless of content, and disappeared from the mass media. For the remainder of the 1950s, Seeger continued to appear at camps and schools and to write songs and pro-labor union and anti-war editorials, which appeared in his column in the folk music magazine Sing Out, under the pen name of Johnny Appleseed. The Weavers were temporarily silenced but returned to sing before a rapturous crowd of fans in a reunion concert at Carnegie Hall in 1955. Issued in 1957, the album documenting this concert, The Weavers at Carnegie Hall, became a highly influential best-selling LP album. A second Weavers LP, Folk Songs Around the World, issued in 1959, was limited to traditional songs and spirituals. Paul Robeson, singer, actor, athlete, and civil rights activist, was investigated by the FBI and was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, WAC, for his outspoken political views. The State Department denied Robeson a passport and issued a stop notice at all ports, effectively confining him to the United States. In a symbolic act of defiance against the travel ban, labor unions in the US and Canada organized a concert at the International Peace Arch on the border between Washington State and the Canadian province of British Columbia on May 18, 1952. Robeson stood on the back of a flatbed truck on the American side of the US-Canada border and performed a concert for a crowd on the Canadian side, variously estimated at between 20,000 and 40,000 people. Robeson returned to perform a second concert at the Peace Arch in 1953, and over the next 2 years 2 further concerts were scheduled. In the 1940s, one of the leading musical voices of protest from the African American community in America was Josh White, one of the first musicians to make a name for himself singing political blues. White enjoyed a position of political privilege, especially as a black musician, as he established a long and close relationship with the family of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and would become the closest African American confidant to the President of the United States. He made his first foray into protest music and political blues with his highly controversial Columbia Records album Joshua White and His Carolinians, Chain Gang, produced by John H. Hammond, which included the song Trouble, which summarized the plight of many African Americans in its opening line of, "Well, I always been in trouble, 'cause I'm a black-skinned man." The album was the first race record ever forced upon the white radio stations and record stores in America's South, and caused such a furor that it reached the desk of President Roosevelt. On December 20, 1940, White and the Golden Gate Quartet, sponsored by Eleanor Roosevelt, performed in a historic Washington, D.C. concert at the Library of Congress's Coolidge Auditorium to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which abolished slavery. In January 1941, White performed at the president's inauguration, and 2 months later he released another highly controversial record album, Southern Exposure, which included 6 anti-segregationist songs with liner notes written by the celebrated and equally controversial African-American writer Richard Wright, and whose subtitle was An Album of Jim Crow Blues, like the Chain Gang album, and with revelatory yet inflammatory songs such as Uncle Sam Says, Jim Crow Train, Bad Housing Blues, Defense Factory Blues, Southern Exposure, and Hard Time Blues. It also was forced upon the Southern white radio stations and record stores, caused outrage in the South, and also was brought to the attention of President Roosevelt. A month later, White sang as a member of the Almanac Singers on their much criticized anti-peacetime draft album, Songs for John Doe. Despite this, however, and White's membership in the Almanac Singers, instead of making White persona non grata in segregated America, resulted in President Roosevelt asking White to become the first African American artist to give a White House command performance in 1941, for the Roosevelts were great fans of folk music.